At the time, it was Faye's story. He was asked by an acquaintance to expel evil spirits from their son. The boy had been acting strangely lately, and today he had a violent convulsion and attempted suicide. The eyes were filled with veins and blood, and nose and mouth walls were dripping profusely. It appeared to be excruciatingly painful. Faye was holding a coin in his hand and muttering something strange and perplexing at the moment. Then he pressed the coin firmly against the boy's brow and continued to recite the spell. After a while, the boy returned to normal, stopped convulsing, and fell asleep. Faye then told the boy's family that everything was fine and told them something. They were so moved and fired by Faye that they invited him to dinner and sleep over the next day, but Faye declined out of fear of disturbing the host. The boy's father had to see us off because it was still early. We also planned to take a taxi home quickly. However, after a while of walking, it began to rain heavily, so we decided to stay in a nearby hotel. Our clothes were soaked, and I even blamed Faye for not knowing it was going to rain today. I even teased Faye, asking if everything was going as is planned. Faye said nothing and simply told me to hurry into the hotel. "You were not my style. Forget the crazy idea," Faye said. When we entered, a middle-aged man, most likely the owner, stood up to greet us. "Welcome to our hotel. Please come in." The first thing which drew my attention to him was his limp leg. Faye booked a room with 2 beds after providing personal information. At the point, I heard a child's voice behind me and turned to look. It had to be the owner's son. The only difference was his legs were limp like his father's. The owner began to lead us to check in, and at the same time a child emerged from the inside. And by the way, the boy was also the owner's son, according to the talk between 2 of them. And the first child was the eldest brother, while the one was the younger brother. And it was odd, because the younger brother also liked his father and eldest brother. His legs were also limp. At the time, I inadvertently complimented the owner on his good fortune in having 2 sons. But it appeared that the owner was not happy, as he sighed and stated that his family had 3 sons, all of whom were karma. Faye and I were both very curious at the time, so we looked at each other. When we entered the room, the owner came out and told us to call him if we needed anything. At that point, I began discussing with what the boss had said earlier with Faye. I was in the middle of a conversation when I became extremely hungry because neither Faye nor I had eaten since the afternoon. "Hey, were you hungry? Let's go eat some cup of noodles." The owner was eager to assist us in filling the boiling water and even gave us more sausages. While eating, I inadvertently inquired about his family's story, wondering if it was a hereditary problem with lameness. It was not a disease or a hereditary problem, it was a curse. They seemed to sense something, so he inquired how long their leg's condition had been. According to the owner, his leg was first affected just over 10 years ago, followed by each of his children one by one. At the point, Faye looked around and inquired about the timeline for constructing the hotel. The owner now appeared to have just thought of something. He stated the hotel was built around the same time when he had problems with his legs. They began to smile and asked him to get him a compass which would show ghosts. I knew Faye had seen something, so I quickly took out the compass and recircled the house. I asked Faye what he saw, but he just smiled and looked at the compass. We were walking towards the center of the house when the compass needle violently turned. Faye said, "Hey boss, did you have any disagreements with anyone while building the place?" The question surprised the owner as well, because there had been a fight with a person. It was the carpenter who was in charge of the portion of the hotel's construction, who was enraged because everyone was smoking while working. At the time, the owner didn't seem to mind and said it was normal, but he became angrier and raised his voice at his master. The owner stated that he was only a hired worker, so why would he prohibit other people from smoking? The owner was so annoyed that he asked him to leave work early and not have to go back to work. During the time, the owner of the hotel only quarreled with him. According to Faye, the owner had been enchanted for many years, and the spell was still in effect in the house, making his family miserable. Faye said, "Please bring me a hammer or an axe." When the hotel owner arrived with the tool, Faye handed it to me and told me to smash the floor. I couldn't stand it because I was curious, so I obediently followed it. Because the floor was so hard, it was a little difficult to break right away. It took a long time to break a small hole at the point. Faye stopped me and told us to look at the floor. Something appeared to be visible beneath the floor now, hidden behind the broken bricks. It appeared to have been buried there for a long time. It took a great deal of effort to get it off the ground. It was an old wooden box, but it was still in good condition. I admired Faye because despite being so deep underground, he could see everything. Faye said, "If the interior was made of wood, it must be made by a carpenter. If it was made of clay, it must be made by a builder." When the box was opened, 4 wooden puppets were inside. The strange thing was all 4 puppets had a broken leg which looked very weird. I picked up the puppets and wondered why they had broken their legs in such a way. Then I abruptly realized that the broken legs matched the boss and his son. The owner was terrified and taken aback because the family's misfortunes were all the result of an argument. The owner begged, "Please help me and my children break the spell." Faye said, "It's a Luban charm, which is well known in the carpentry world. The spell is simple to break, but if it did, the person who casted it would be receiving his own wrath back 100 times. The owner had a sad expression on his face. He stated that the carpenter died in a car accident a few years ago. After hearing the owner's statement, Faye immediately asked him to bring a mirror. Then he asked me to return the box to its original location, cover it with a mirror, and place 4 coins in each of the 4 corners. According to Faye, their legs would be completely healed in about a year. The owner was very grateful and offered us a free room and asked to pay more for the spell, but Faye refused. I admired Faye once more, and I'd like to ask him to study exorcism. However, Faye stated that his teacher would not accept me. I was curious about the teacher, so I inquired about his name and the location of his cultivation. Faye simply responded that his surname was Zhao and gave a weird smile. Before I went to bed, I tried to persuade Faye to let me join the sect to study. But Faye was still very cold and fell asleep, not paying any attention to my pleadings. I invited Faye to a milk tea shop today with the intention of discussing some issues with him. I took a day off from work, and after we met I talked to him about starting an exorcism business. "I'll find you clients, all you have to do is catch ghosts and we'll make a lot of money." He began to wince, his face becoming irritated because I referred to what he did as business. I realized I had made a mistake, so I apologized to him and asked for his assistance with the case. He didn't respond to me. Instead, he held a cup of milk tea and continuously drank while listening. According to the story, Mr. Wu was an old acquaintance of mine. He had some old rooms for rent, but one of them had recently been haunted. It had been almost a year, and his family was still very happy at the time. He had a son who got married and had a grandson. Everything was fine until his daughter-in-law became involved in an affair. So the two divorced, and the husband, rather than chasing his wife away, took the initiative to bring his son to the city to live together. When Mr. Wu saw his daughter-in-law staying in the room and not coming out in a few days, he decided to enter the room to check out for what happened. Then he discovered something terrible that was still making him suffer until now. The daughter-in-law hanged herself in the room. Her face was pale and her protruding tongue blood red. He rented out that room after his daughter-in-law died, but all of the tenants were so terrified of her ghost that made the surrounding rooms become empty. According to Faye, there was only one possible explanation. 1. Her ghost was trapped, and the other was, she didn't want to leave the place. I believed that he would agree on the case, so I suggested him to come and check out the scene. Faye was still upset, and he asked me if I had already received Mr. Wu's money. I was perplexed and assumed he needed it, so I offered to send it all to him. He refused, telling me to keep them all, and walked away. He seemed angry. He didn't want to wait for me and went straight to the street to catch a cab. So we entered the taxi and started to travel to the location. Following Mr. Wu's instructions, we arrived at his house quickly. He came out from the house to greet us warmly. After that, I introduced him to Faye. He was very down because the rent was a small sum of money that helped him in enjoying his retirement, but no renter anymore, so he begged Faye to help him. Faye was a very quiet person, so he offered to go to the room and take a look, and then return. I could only quietly follow him at this point. The strange thing was that Mr. Wu hadn't said anything yet, but he knew exactly which one to look for among these 4 rooms. This room has the most yin. The ghost must still be here, Faye said. I was so scared, so I hid behind Faye when he slowly opened the door. There weren't many things inside, and the room looked almost empty. I expected him to sprinkle some powder, but it didn't seem necessary this time. I felt a little shivery in this murky room. Looking up at the wooden crossbar above, I assumed that was where she committed suicide. Faye abruptly stated that I might need to stay here tonight, which surprised him. Is he going to use me as ghost bait? I thought. Faye required Mr. Wu to allow me to stay one night and he would take care of the situation. Mr. Wu was very welcoming and said he would prepare blankets and pillows for me to stay the night. Then we politely stated to go to prepare some things for the night. On the way, I began to complain about sleeping there, saying that it was too dangerous. But Faye's response left me speechless. You took money for this case, so why don't you take the danger? That night we both met at Mr. Wu's house. As soon as I walked into the room, I felt worried. Faye told me to stay calm because nothing bad would happen. But how could I stay calm? If that woman doesn't show up tonight, we'll have to stay here for a few more nights, Faye said. This worried me even more, and when Faye turned away I tried to ask for a self-defense charm from him or something. You've watched too many movies. There's nothing to be afraid of, he said with a smile. Faye exited the room and shut the door, leaving me alone in the room. I regretted taking this case. I could only grit my teeth and lie down on the bed at this point. I could imagine where the woman hanged herself and how unsightly she looked when she died. The more I looked up there, the more spine-chilling effect I felt. Then I lied down and stared at the crossbar until I fell asleep. I heard a strange sound, followed by the sound of running water, which became clearer and clearer. It gave me a headache, woke me up. I attempted to open my eyes but couldn't. The scene that followed, however, jolted me awake with a pair of feet floating in front of me. The woman hanging on the gallows was staring at me with frightening bloodshot eyes. All I could do now was back up and scream in terror. She drew closer to me, her neck still clinging to the rope. Her pale face and long tongue was staring at me. Faye threw open the door just when I thought I was going to die. His hand was doing something strange. Later on I discovered that it was the symbol of the magic he used. He gently waved his hand, and I thought he was very cool right now. The woman's ghost was hurled away by an unknown force. "Why don't you just leave, ghost? Why do you stay in this disturbance?" Faye said heavily. The ghost was now terrified in front of Faye. She declared that she wouldn't leave her house and didn't want anyone to stay around. Faye said, "You are no longer in this world. I will take strong action if you don't leave." The woman began to cry and begged Faye. She wanted to wait for her husband and his son. Faye considered that she shouldn't have an affair if she'd loved her family that much. She began crying even harder, and then told Faye that she was the victim. She was a company secretary. That day when she was going out for dinner with everybody, her boss forced her to do something. He forced her to drink alcohol so much that she would lose consciousness. Later he brought her to his home. Then he depraved her and didn't admit what he did. Faye believed that she wouldn't remember anything after reincarnation, so why not let go? She didn't resent the boss. She just wanted to see her husband and son one more time. I was moved by the story and wanted Faye to help her. Faye then instructed me to go find a black umbrella. I was overjoyed and went straight to Mr. Wu to borrow an umbrella. Faye turned to face the girl, holding the umbrella, and told her to come inside. She immediately transformed into smoke and climbed into the umbrella. Faye took a red string from his bag and tied it to the umbrella. Then we took the umbrella and went to a city elementary school. It was right after school, so it was extremely crowded. After some time, Faye opened the umbrella. She was standing under the umbrella, according to Faye. A boy and a man appeared at the gate after a few minutes. Suddenly, a cloud of black smoke billowed from the umbrella. She had seen her son and was about to step out of the umbrella when the sun burned her, so Faye told her not to go out. We followed the father and son down the road. The boy was walking when he turned his head to look at us. He told his father that he heard his mother calling him. The husband turned to look but saw nothing. I guess the woman called her son. We followed them for a long time before coming to a halt at a bend. Faye folded the umbrella and declared, "Enough here." Then Faye went under a bridge. He placed the umbrella and took me away. I was not sure why we left her there. However, Faye stated that there was a transit station and that someone would come and take her away. We walked together for a while before parting. I had a plan as soon as I turned away. I went to the company where the woman worked before and waited for the boss to leave. I approached him with a brick in my hand. As soon as I raised the brick, Faye grabbed one as well and dashed forwards. Both were taken aback by the other's appearance. There was a noise followed by a cry for help. The cops on patrol began to pursue us. When I asked Faye why he did this, he explained that he wanted to avenge for the son's sake. As for me, I wanted to avenge the woman. So because of this, Faye and I had to stay at home for several days in a row and couldn't go out. After the previous cases, I felt closer to Faye, so I invited him to go out for milk tea in free time. I also really wanted to learn about his ability to capture demons, but he just smiled and he didn't answer my questions. He just said I was like a curious child, and he was right. While we were talking, Faye's phone rang loudly. I could just hear someone was begging him to do something. After hanging up the phone, Faye stood up and said goodbye to me. "I have urgent business to attend to." Because I had some spare time, I followed him. He didn't say anything as I got into the taxi with him. I was interested to know where he was going. According to Faye, we would go to a funeral goods store. The store was located on a funeral street and the store was next to the hospital. Next, we started to enter one of the many stores on the street. As soon as we walked in, the owner welcomed us warmly, as if the owner and Faye already knew one another. "Faye, you must help me, otherwise I will have to close my store and relocate somewhere else." Faye reassured him and asked him to clarify the details. We sat down and the owner started talking about the terrifying events of the previous night. When the owner was about to close the shop, a customer walked in. The customer was an old man. He appeared to be over 70 years old. The man had a weak figure. The owner still very enthusiastically welcomed the old man and asked what the old man needed. The old man said he needed to buy a pair of shoes. The owner asked the old man for the size and if the old man wanted to buy it for men or women. However, the old man stated that he wanted to buy the shoes for himself. The owner was a bit surprised, but the owner assumed it was normal for the old man to purchase a gift for himself. So the owner looked down to see the size of the old man's feet. But as soon as he looked down, he panicked. The old man walked barefoot. His pants and feet were covered with blood. When the owner turned around, he saw bloodstains all over the floor. When the owner examined the elderly man's face attentively, he saw that the old man did not appear to be a lively person since his face was grey and gloomy. The owner had been doing the job for decades, so he also realized that something was wrong. Then the owner used an excuse to get some goods and he quickly moved into the warehouse. When the owner arrived at the warehouse, the owner locked the door behind him. He feared that the old man would follow him. Therefore he stood in the warehouse and he didn't dare to go out at all. About an hour later, the owner heard a knock on the door and a call from his wife. He had just stepped outside at that point and his wife was surprised to see him with such an expression. Outside, the old man had disappeared. There were only shoes scattered on the floor, and even his wife thought that the thief had broken in. Then the owner panicked and told his wife about the old man. "It's terrible, darling. I just met a ghost. He came here to buy shoes for himself." The owner wanted to prove his words. He hurried to get to the computer to turn on the camera. But when he checked the camera, he panicked even more. The wife was very confused because there was no old man on the camera. On the camera, she just looked at the owner who was talking to himself. After hearing the owner's story, the wife also started to feel scared. The owner was afraid that the old man would come back again tonight, so he called Faye. Faye had a smile on his face and told the owner to leave early tonight and we would stay at the shop. The owner was very happy to see us off and we promised to meet at the shop later that night. I was wondering. I couldn't help him. However, Faye wanted me to stay. "Tonight I need you to disguise yourself as the owner of the shop." After hearing that, I expected an extremely dangerous and thrilling experience for me. After that, Faye stated that he needed to find something, so I just followed him. I followed him to a votive store. The store was full of paper people, paper horses, handmade paper furniture. They were not printed items like other places. The owner seemed to be too familiar with Faye and he directly asked Faye what to look for this time. Faye: "I need a pair of paper shoes for a special guest." The shopkeeper immediately understood Faye's words, and because he had skill and skillful hands, the keeper made a pair of shoes very quickly. A pair of beautifully textured gold shoes were quickly completed, And of course, the shoes were made with a special charm that only Faye and the shop owner could understand. Then we went back to the funeral store in the evening. I sat in the store and I pretended to be a salesman, and I anxiously waited. I stared at the door and couldn't take my eyes off it for a second. I was so nervous because I was about to be face to face with a ghost. Behind the door, the feeling of anticipation made me feel weak. The old man could arrive at any time. About 10 o'clock that night, the door suddenly opened as an old man entered. Like the owner described, the old man had a grave face and looked very scary. The most terrifying thing was that he was barefoot and that blood was trailing in his wake. I mustered up my courage, picked up the paper shoes and went out to greet him. Then he tried the shoes on, and the shoes looked really good actually. He was pleased and gave me a bill. I trembled when I realized it was the money of the underworld. Then he immediately left. I breathed a sigh of relief. As soon as he left, I rushed to follow him and saw Faye. He was standing outside. With the speed of old people, of course, the old man couldn't go very fast. Faye then took out a red bandage from his pocket and he asked me to put it on. I was curious to know why, but Faye just kept silent. I also obediently followed, of course. I thought that if I put it on, I would maybe not see anything. But the bandage was very thin, so I could still see in front of me a bit. I saw something strange. There was a long line of footprints on the ground. Faye said the footprints were that of the old man, as we followed him to know where he was going. After that, we were so focused on following the footsteps that we walked longer than 15 minutes. Finally, we reached the destination, which was a nearby hospital. We continued to follow the footsteps. We passed a bend and a corridor, and we came to a small room behind the hospital. Faye looked like he knew he would enter this room, so he wasn't surprised to see the man. Then Faye took out his phone, and from the sound of it, I guess he was calling the manager of the hospital. I was more and more amazed with his wide connections. More than 10 minutes later, the manager rushed over. He seemed to have known Faye for a long time, and he was pleased that Faye had a job for him. After Faye's offer, he led us into a room which was a morgue. And according to Faye's description of the old man, the manager recognized the old man. He had been dead here for many days, but his relatives didn't come to pick him up. As soon as the manager opened the white cloth, even though I was mentally prepared, I still felt chills. And the old man's body was indeed wearing a pair of paper shoes that I gave him earlier. The old man's legs and pants were covered in dried blood, just like when I sold him the shoes. The manager was surprised because he remembered that the old man wasn't wearing any paper shoes before. Faye, do you know why the old man died? The manager said that he was sent from the construction site because of a working accident. Faye asked the manager to check the old man's information on their system. Faye wanted to know his name and date of birth. Then we said our goodbyes. The manager seemed to really respect Faye. When we arrived back at the funeral store, Faye selected a new suit and shoes for the old man, and Faye wrote his name and date of birth on them. I didn't understand what Faye was doing, so I asked him. Faye said that when people die and their relatives don't come to retrieve them, their spirits become very lonely and ashamed of their state, so we shouldn't let any of them go without nice burial clothes. Faye said we needed to take it to the nearest intersection to burn it. At that time I thought, was the old man really going to receive these items? Everything burned really quickly and it was already past midnight. Because I was so tired, I planned to go home and sleep right away, but Faye made me clean up the ashes of the paper clothes before I could go home. As for the funeral shop, Faye said that the owner needed to light firecrackers and incense in front of the door. The business would then return to normal. Indeed, after the story I experienced another rather interesting incident with ghosts, and so I was learning more and more about Faye's talents and skills.